My name is Marin Mathis, and I was 32 years old when my parents put a price on me, $500,000. The buyer was a man I had never met, paralyzed from the waist down, sitting in a wheelchair at the end of a gravel driveway in rural Nebraska. My mother handed me a pen and called it a fresh start. I called Daniel, the man I'd loved for 4 years, and ended everything in under 3 minutes. That was supposed to be the worst day of my life. It wasn't even close because 1 year later, in a room full of people who thought they'd gotten away with it, I opened a folder. Every person at that table, my parents, my husband's brother, their attorney, went white. Here's what none of them knew. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where ordinary people meet impossible families and find their footing through patience, principle, and one well-timed truth. If a story here ever helps you breathe a little easier, that's the whole point. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. I need to back up. I grew up in a town so small that the post office and the church shared a parking lot. My parents, Lorraine and Wade Mathis, ran a cycle of debt, drink, and quiet violence that I learned to navigate the way other kids learn to ride bikes, early, clumsily, and with scars. I got out at 18. Scholarships, a geology degree from the University of Nebraska, then a master's in geochemistry paid for with 3 part-time jobs and 4 hours of sleep a night. By 31, I was mapping mineral formations for the State Geological Survey. Quiet work. Precise. The kind of career where nobody claps for you. But the data doesn't lie. Daniel Pute found me at a conference in Omaha. Software engineer. Warm eyes. A laugh that filled rooms I'd spent years keeping silent. We dated for 4 years. He proposed on a Tuesday with a ring he'd spent 11 months saving for. I said yes before he finished the sentence. The phone rang the next morning. My mother's voice hadn't changed in 13 years. Same cadence. Same way of starting a conversation like she was resuming one you'd never agreed to. We're in trouble, Marin. Real trouble. I asked how much. She said it wasn't about money. It was about family. There's a way out for all of us. I told her no twice. The third time she went quiet. Then she said the thing she always said, after everything we sacrificed for you. I sat on the edge of my bed with Daniel's ring still warm on my finger and waited for whatever came next. Because with Lorraine Mathis, there was always something next. They showed up 3 days later. No call ahead. Just 2 people in a rented sedan standing at my apartment door in Lincoln like they'd been invited. Wade looked thinner. Lorraine looked the same. Pressed blouse, painted nails, eyes that tracked the room like she was appraising it. Sit down, baby. We have something wonderful. She opened a leather folder on my kitchen table. Inside were photographs of a house, a property map, and a typewritten letter from an attorney I'd never heard of. The Holloway family, she explained, lived outside a town called Cedar Bluff. They had a son, Robert, 35, paraplegic. A rockfall at a mine site 4 years ago had severed his spinal cord at the waist. His family was offering $500,000 to any woman willing to marry him. They want a wife for him. Someone steady. You're steady, Marin. Wade studied the floor. Lorraine tapped the folder like it was a brochure for a vacation. He can't do better than you. That's the point. I asked her to leave. She didn't move. We owe $160,000. The house is gone in 90 days. Your father's liver won't make it past a second round of collections. This money. She pressed her palm flat on the folder. This money fixes everything. It doesn't fix me. She blinked. Just once. Then she refolded her hands and smiled the way she smiled when I was 9 and tried to lock my bedroom door. Honey, you've been fixing yourself your whole life. Let us catch up. I didn't sleep that week. I turned the ring on my finger until the skin went raw. And I kept coming back to the same thought. If I said no, they'd lose the house. If I said yes, I'd lose myself. I already knew which one I'd choose. I drove to Daniel's apartment on a Tuesday, the same day of the week he'd proposed. He opened the door, smiling, coffee in one hand, his laptop balanced on a stack of books. A normal evening for a man who didn't know what was coming. Hey, you hungry? I sat on the arm of his couch and pulled the ring off my finger, set it on the coffee table between us. The diamond caught the kitchen light. Neither of us looked away from it. Marin, I can't marry you. He put the coffee down, sat across from me, hands on his knees. He didn't raise his voice. Daniel never raised his voice. He just watched me like he was waiting for the part that made sense. Is there someone else? No. Then what changed? Everything. Nothing I could explain without unraveling the last 13 years of keeping my family at arm's length and still feeling their fingers on my collar. I had spent my whole life being the useful one, the one who got out, got the degree, got the job, and now the bill had come due. Just tell me who he is. I didn't answer. I couldn't say there is no other man. There is only a transaction my mother arranged because she sees love as currency and children as accounts receivable. Daniel held the ring for a long time after I left. I know because he told me later, months later in a parking lot in 4 sentences I'll get to. But that night I drove home with the heater off and the windows down and the Nebraska cold pressing against my face like a hand trying to wake me up. I let it. The wedding was set for March 8th, 6 weeks from the night I gave back the ring. Lorraine managed the preparations the way a project manager runs a sprint. Dress ordered online, $89, no alterations. Venue, the Holloway property, guest list, immediate family only. She printed a schedule and taped it to the motel mirror the night before. Hair at 7, photos at 8:30, ceremony at 10 o'clock. I watched her iron my dress on the motel bed. Steam curled off the fabric. She smoothed every crease like she was pressing a contract. You're doing the right thing, Marin. You keep saying that because you keep needing to hear it. She hung the dress on the back of the bathroom door and turned to me with a look I recognized. The one that came right before she said something she'd been rehearsing. You were always going to pay us back. I let the sentence sit. Didn't fight it, didn't flinch. Because some sentences aren't arguments, they're confessions. And Lorraine had just told me exactly what I was to her. Not a daughter, but a deferred payment. Wade sat in the car the whole time. I saw him through the window, hands on the steering wheel, engine off, staring at the dashboard. He didn't come in. He never came in. What I didn't know yet, Lorraine had already spent $68,000 of the $500. Debts she'd hidden from Wade, a second credit line, a payment on a storage unit full of things she'd bought during a manic stretch the previous fall. The money was already bleeding before the ink was dry. I packed my suitcase. At the bottom, under the folded shirts, I placed my field kit, hand lens, sample bags, GPS unit. Old habit. The tools of a life I wasn't sure I'd get to keep. The Holloway property sat on 200 acres of flat, dull land that looked like it had given up. Dead grass, a grain silo with a leaning roof, a farmhouse that had been white once and was now the color of old teeth. Robert was at the end of the driveway. He wore a dark jacket, clean shirt, hands folded in his lap, and in his right palm, a brass compass, small, tarnished, the kind surveyors used 50 years ago. His wheelchair sat on a plywood ramp someone had built in a hurry. The wood was still raw. The ceremony took 11 minutes. A county clerk, no music. Wade shook Robert's hand without meeting his eyes. Lorraine smiled for a photograph that nobody had asked her to pose for. Afterward, when the families drifted toward the house, Robert stayed on the porch. I stood next to him because I didn't know where else to go. He looked at the fields, then at me. You don't have to stand there. I don't know where I'm supposed to stand. He almost smiled. Almost. Nobody asked you either, did they? 5 words. And in those 5 words, every assumption I had carried into this marriage, that he was passive, that he was helpless, that this was something done to me and not equally done to him, cracked wide open. This man wasn't confused about what was happening. He saw it clearly, completely. I looked at the compass in his hand. My grandfather's, he said. He mapped this whole county when nobody cared. Said the dirt here was worth more than the corn. I nodded. I didn't know what that meant yet, but something in the way he held that compass, loose, familiar, like it was an extension of his hand, stayed with me long after we went inside. Garrett Holloway was 41, 6 feet 3 inches, and built like a man who'd never missed a meal or a chance to remind you he was paying for it. He arrived the evening of the wedding with a handshake that lasted too long and a voice that filled every room before you could settle into it. Welcome to the family, Marin. You need anything, you come to me. Not to Robert, to me. Within the first week, I understood the architecture of the Holloway household. Garrett controlled the finances. Garrett managed what he called the family trust, the legal entity that held the land, the equipment, the accounts. Garrett made the phone calls, signed the papers, and spoke about Robert in the third person, even when Robert was 3 feet away. He gets tired in the afternoons. Don't let him overdo it. He needs the south-facing room. The light helps. Robert doesn't get a vote. That last one came at the kitchen table one Tuesday over a stack of county tax documents Robert had asked to see. Garrett didn't even look up. He just said it flat, like announcing the weather. Robert's jaw tightened. His fingers curled once around the armrest of his chair. Then he released them and said nothing. I washed dishes that night and thought about a word I hadn't used since grad school: overburden. In geology, it's the layer of rock and soil sitting on top of something valuable. You have to remove it before you can see what's underneath. Garrett talked about the land often. The trust held it. The trust managed it. The trust, meaning Garrett, would decide what happened to it. But nobody had told me what the land was actually worth, and nobody had explained why Garrett was suddenly so eager to keep Robert away from the paperwork. The first year moved in seasons. Spring. Robert and I lived in parallel, separate rooms, polite mornings. He read in the study, his father's old room, still stacked with rolled maps and geology textbooks I recognized from my own shelves. I drove 40 minutes each way to the survey office in Grand Island and came home to a quiet house. Summer. I found him in the barn one afternoon, tools spread across his lap, rewiring the well pump motor. His hands moved with a precision that didn't match the story Garrett told about him. I stood in the doorway for a full minute before he noticed me. The impeller was shot. Garrett was going to pay someone $400 to fix it. How'd you learn to do that? I have a degree in hydrogeology and 6 years of field work. A pause. The chair didn't take that. Connie, the home health aide who came Tuesdays and Thursdays, told me the rest. Robert had worked for a mining consultancy before the accident, specializing in groundwater mapping and subsurface geology. His father had done the same work, self-taught decades earlier before the family shifted to grain. He's the smartest person in this house, Connie said, folding linens. Garrett just doesn't like admitting it. Fall, we started eating dinner together. Not romantic, just present. He'd talk about water tables. I'd talk about clay formations. Two people fluent in the same technical language, learning they could finish each other's sentences. Winter, he made me laugh. A real one. The kind that catches you off guard and leaves a mark. I had married a man my family called useless. He was the only person in either family who had never lied to me. And by the end of that first year, I was starting to understand that the ground beneath this house held more than anyone suspected. The call came in February, 11 months after the wedding. Lorraine's voice had that particular texture it got when she needed something, softer at the edges, warmer than usual, like she was trying on a personality she'd seen in a movie about good mothers. How's married life? What do you need, Mom? A pause. I heard Wade cough in the background. Then Lorraine dropped the act. The money's almost gone. $500,000. 11 months. I did the math while she talked. The house payoff was $140. Medical bills. Wade's liver. 2 ER visits. Another $30. The storage unit, the credit lines, a truck Lorraine bought and returned at a loss. And the $68,000 she'd already spent before I even walked down that plywood ramp. We need help, Marin. Just a little. I don't have money to give you. You're living on a 200-acre property. Your husband's family has land. They have accounts. None of that is mine. She went quiet in the way that meant she was about to change tactics. We're still family, Marin. Family helps. I sat on the porch steps after I hung up. The fields stretched out flat and colorless in every direction. A hawk circled low over the grain silo. Somewhere inside, Robert was reading. They had sold me for $500,000. And the $500,000 hadn't even lasted a year. The old pattern was already pulling at me. The urge to be useful, to earn my place, to fix what they broke so they'd stop breaking me. I recognized it the way a recovering addict recognizes the first sip. I didn't pick up when she called again that night or the night after. It was the first boundary I'd set in 32 years, and it took everything I had. Robert's father had died 2 years before the accident. Heart attack in the field, boots still muddy. The family buried him on a Thursday and argued about the land by Friday. The study had been his oak desk, a drafting table pushed against the window, rolled maps in canvas tubes lining the walls like artillery shells. 3 shelves of books I recognized. Fetter's Applied Hydrogeology, a dog-eared copy of Dana's Manual, a stack of USGS bulletins from the 1970s. Your father was a geologist? Robert wheeled in behind me. Self-taught. Spent 30 years mapping formations nobody asked him to map. People thought he was eccentric. Garrett thought he was wasting time. I pulled a tube from the wall and unrolled it on the drafting table. Hand-drawn cross-sections, neat, careful line work, formation labels in block letters. The man had known what he was doing. He was good. He was obsessed. Robert positioned himself beside the table. He believed there was something under this land that nobody had identified. Spent the last decade of his life sampling and documenting. Did he find anything? He thought so. Nobody listened. I studied the cross-section. The formations were consistent with the broader stratigraphic column I worked with daily. Cretaceous shales, tertiary deposits, the usual sequence. But one layer was highlighted in pencil, traced repeatedly, annotated with notes I couldn't quite read from where I stood. A gray band, thin, persistent. What did he call this layer? Robert shrugged. The gray seam. That's all he ever said. The gray seam. I stared at it. Something stirred in the patient part of my brain, the part trained not to jump to conclusions, but to wait for data. It stirred. I rolled the map back up gently. On a Sunday afternoon in late March, Robert told me about the accident. We were on the porch. He had the brass compass open in his palm, the needle trembling north. The same compass I'd seen at the wedding. The one his grandfather had carried through 40 years of field surveys. Rockfall at a site in Wyoming, he said. Consulting job. The wall gave out 20 feet above me. 2 vertebrae. Clean break. He closed the compass. Opened it again. They medevaced me to Casper. Garrett flew out the next morning, not to sit with me, but to call the insurance company. He told me the rest in pieces, the way people tell stories they've carried alone for too long. After the accident, Garrett stepped in, took over the accounts, restructured the family trust to centralize decision-making, filed paperwork, giving himself signatory authority over the land, the equipment, the bank accounts. He told the family I couldn't manage my own affairs. Robert's voice stayed level. Said the injury had affected my cognition. It hadn't. But by the time I could prove that, everything was already in his name. And the marriage was Garrett's idea. Find a wife, settle me down, make it look like I'm taken care of. Then he's free to do whatever he wants with the trust. Nobody asked you either, did they? He looked at me. The same 5 words he'd said at the wedding, but this time they landed differently. Not as an observation, but as a bond. 2 people sold into the same arrangement by families who thought they were furniture. My grandfather used to say, the best things in the ground are the ones nobody's looking for. He handed me the compass. Hold on to this for a while. I think you'll need it more than I do. I took it. The brass was warm from his hand. Garrett organized a Sunday dinner in April. Both families. His idea of a celebration. Really, his idea of a stage. The dining room table seated 8, Garrett at the head, his wife Brenda quiet as wallpaper. 2 Holloway cousins who kept checking their phones, and across from Robert and me, Lorraine and Wade, freshly driven from their rented apartment 3 hours east. The chicken was dry. The wine was cheap. The conversation was choreographed. Lorraine started. We've been thinking, Marin, about the future. She glanced at Garrett. About what this family could do together if we all pulled in the same direction. Garrett cut his meat. Didn't look up. Robert, I brought those trust documents. The ones we talked about. We didn't talk about them. The ones I mentioned. Consolidation paperwork. Makes everything cleaner going forward. He slid a manila folder across the table. Robert didn't touch it. Just sign where I marked. Don't overthink this. Lorraine leaned toward me. You are always going to pay us back. Same words, same flat delivery. Like she was reading from a card she kept in her pocket for exactly these moments. This is how it works, honey. Family takes care of family. I looked at the folder, looked at Garrett, looked at my mother. 2 separate agendas converging over one table. Lorraine wanted more money. Garrett wanted Robert's signature on a document that would lock the land into a trust Robert had no control over. And they were working in tandem without even realizing they'd found each other. Robert pushed the folder back across the table. I'll read it first. Garrett's fork stopped midair. There's nothing to read. It's standard. Then it'll be standard when I finish reading it. The table went silent. I picked up my water glass and said nothing. But I watched Garrett's eyes, and what I saw was a man who was suddenly in a hurry. The land agent called on a Wednesday. I answered because Robert was in the shower and the phone was on the kitchen counter. A man named Dale Kessler calling from a minerals acquisition firm in Denver. I'm looking for the property owner at the Holloway parcel, Section 14. We'd like to discuss a preliminary assessment of subsurface mineral potential. We've been reviewing geological data in the region, and your section is within our area of interest. I wrote down his name and number, hung up, and stood at the counter for a long time. That evening, I told Robert. He set down his book. Garrett got a call like that 3 weeks ago. I heard him on the porch. He told the man to call back after the paperwork was finalized. What paperwork? The trust consolidation. The thing he wants me to sign. I sat in the chair across from him. The living room was quiet. A clock ticked on the mantel. Robert, he never cared about this land before. No, he didn't. Something changed. Something's under it. He said it simply, the way a man who grew up around surveyors says things about the ground. Not a guess, a recognition. I thought about the maps in the study. The gray seam his father had traced in pencil. The land agent's careful phrasing, subsurface mineral potential. We need to see what's in your father's files. Robert nodded. There's a box in the study. Cedar top shelf. I haven't opened it since he died. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and thought about overburden, the weight of everything sitting on top of the thing that matters. Tomorrow I would start digging. The cedar box was 18 inches long, 12 inches wide, and heavy enough that I needed both hands to bring it down from the shelf. Robert watched from the doorway of the study. The room smelled like old paper and dust, and the faint sweetness of the cedar itself, a scent I'd come to associate with his father's careful, patient work. I set the box on the drafting table and opened the brass latch. Inside, a rolled survey map smaller than the ones on the walls, a leather-bound field notebook, a manila envelope, and a glass jar about the size of a mason jar filled with gray clay. The clay was dense, fine-grained, the color of wet ash. A strip of masking tape on the jar read in careful block letters, Section 14, gray seam, 42-foot depth. Ha hol ezer kilensas kilensvenyots. I unscrewed the lid, took a pinch between my fingers, and rubbed it. My breath stopped. I had spent a decade reading sediment reports. I had mapped clay formations across 6 counties. I knew the texture of bentonite, the chalky feel of kaolin, the gritty weight of ordinary alluvial clay. This was none of those. This was lighter than it should have been, smoother, with a faint iridescence I'd only seen in one type of formation, a lithium-bearing claystone that 3 separate journal articles had flagged as a frontier target for domestic mineral exploration. My hands were shaking. Robert wheeled closer. Your father took this from 42 feet. That's what it says. I set the jar down and reached for the manila envelope. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a hand-drawn cross-section of Section 14, more detailed than any of the wall maps. The second was a single sheet of legal paper, a deed, yellowed, typed on an old machine, and across the top, language I hadn't seen outside of property law, mineral estate, separate conveyance. I read it twice, then a third time. Then I looked at Robert. This says your grandfather left you the mineral rights personally, not the trust. The clock on the mantel ticked. The cedar box sat open between us, and the gray clay in that jar suddenly weighed more than the entire 200 acres above it. I drove to the survey office the next morning before dawn, signed in, pulled the regional stratigraphic files for the Cedar Bluff Quadrangle, and cross-referenced the formation depths in Robert's father's notebook against the state's published geological column. The gray seam showed up, not by name. Nobody had named it. But the depth, the interval, the position within the tertiary sequence all matched a unit that 2 recent USGS papers had identified as a potential lithium-bearing claystone horizon. A formation that extended across parts of the northern plains but had never been commercially tested. I pulled the papers and read them at my desk with coffee going cold beside me. The lithium concentrations reported in analogous formations ranged from 700 to 1,200 parts per million. The threshold for economic extraction, according to the most recent DOE assessment, was 500. Robert's father had sampled a unit that sat squarely within that window. A unit nobody had assayed because nobody had looked, except him. I had spent a decade training myself not to jump, to wait for lab results, to let the numbers speak before the excitement does. But sitting at that desk with a 20-year-old field notebook, a jar of gray clay, and a father's pencil lines on a hand-drawn map, I could feel the data converging. This wasn't a guess. This was a formation, persistent, mappable, and potentially worth more than every acre of corn the Holloways had ever planted. I closed the notebook, packed it carefully into my bag, drove home with both hands on the wheel and my pulse in my throat. I had spent my whole career reading dirt that other people ignored. Robert's father had done the same thing alone for 30 years, and nobody had listened. The difference now was that someone who could listen was finally holding his work. Robert was on the porch when I got home. Late afternoon. The brass compass sat on the armrest of his chair, catching the low sun. I placed the jar of gray clay on the table between us. I need to send this to a lab. He picked up the jar and turned it in his hands. He'd spent 6 years as a hydrogeologist. He knew what a sediment sample meant. He knew what an assay could reveal. Lithium. I nodded. My father said this dirt would matter one day. Garrett laughed at him, called it his hobby. It wasn't a hobby, Robert. He mapped a formation, a real one, persistent, consistent at depth. And if the assay comes back the way I think it will, this land isn't worthless. It's the opposite. He set the jar down and stared at it. The gray clay sat under the fluorescent light like something unremarkable. A lump of earth in a mason jar with masking tape and block letters. The kind of thing you'd throw away in a kitchen cleanout. Garrett's trying to get me to sign the land into the trust. I know. If I sign, the mineral rights go with it. Everything goes to the entity he controls. That's why he's in such a hurry. Robert was quiet for a long time. The porch creaked under a gust of wind. The fields beyond the driveway stretched to the horizon, flat, empty, and sitting on top of something that could change everything. We verify first, he said quietly. No one knows until we have the data. Agreed. I packed the sample that night, double-bagged it, labeled it with coordinates and depth, and addressed it to Dr. Grace Hollis at the University Lab in Lincoln, a colleague I trusted, who wouldn't ask questions until the numbers gave her a reason to. The jar of gray clay left the house in a padded mailer. What came back 3 weeks later would rewrite every assumption both families had made about the dirt beneath our feet. I ran into Daniel at the hardware store in Grand Island. Late May. I was buying PVC fittings for the well pump. He was in the fastener aisle holding a box of screws like he'd forgotten what he came for. Marin. Danielle. We stood there for a moment. Two people who used to share a bed, now sharing a fluorescent-lit aisle at Menards. He looked the same. Same warm eyes, same way of standing with one hand in his pocket like he was always halfway to relaxed. He'd cut his hair shorter. How are you? I'm okay. Are you happy? I thought about the question, not the polite answer, but the real one. A year ago I would have lied. I would have said yes because that's what useful people do. They perform contentment so nobody asks follow-up questions. I'm becoming something, I said. I'm not sure what yet, but it's mine. He nodded, held the box of screws a little tighter. I kept the ring for 2 months, he said. Then I donated it to the women's shelter on Vine Street. Figured somebody should get something good out of it. I didn't cry. I wanted to. But the version of me that would have cried in a hardware store, the one who measured her worth by how much she could give away, was fading. Not gone, but quieter. That was the right call. Yeah. He smiled. Just barely. Take care of yourself, Marin. I'm working on it. I watched him walk to the register, paid for my fittings, and drove home with the windows down and the May air pulling at my hair. He had asked if I was happy. For the first time in a year, I didn't have to lie, and I didn't have to explain that happiness for me no longer looked like being needed. It looked like being accurate about myself, about the dirt, and about the man waiting on the porch with a compass and a patience that matched my own. The county recorder's office in Cedar Bluff was a single room in the back of the courthouse staffed by a woman named Pauline, who had been filing land records since 1987. Robert and I arrived at 9 in the morning. I pushed his chair through a door that barely cleared the filing cabinets, older than both of us. We need to trace the chain of title for Section 14, Township 22 North, Range 18 West. Specifically the mineral estate. Pauline adjusted her glasses. Most folks just ask about the surface. We're not most folks. It took 2 hours. Pauline pulled the original plat, the homestead patent, 3 subsequent conveyances, and then the document that changed everything. A separate instrument recorded in 1989 in which Harold Holloway Sr. conveyed the mineral estate of Section 14 directly to his grandson, Robert James Holloway, bypassing the family trust entirely. The language was precise. Mineral estate, separate conveyance. All rights to subsurface minerals, ores, and associated substances held in fee simple unto the named grantee and his heirs. Robert stared at the certified copy. My grandfather left me the minerals. Personally. Not the trust. Not Garrett. Garrett doesn't know. Garrett can't know. This was recorded separately. It's a split estate. The surface belongs to the trust, but the mineral rights belong to you. They've always belonged to you. Pauline stamped the copy and slid it across the counter. Anything else? Robert folded the document and placed it inside his jacket against his chest. Close. We drove home in silence. The road was flat and straight, and the fields on either side looked exactly the way they always had, unremarkable, patient, keeping a secret that had been recorded in a courthouse drawer for 35 years. Nobody had bothered to look until now. Garrett came to the house 3 times that week. Monday, he brought revised trust documents, a thicker stack this time, with post-it flags marking every signature line. This is simpler than the last version. Robert consolidates everything clean. Robert didn't pick them up. Wednesday, Garrett brought his attorney, a man named Aaron Briggs, who sat in the kitchen and explained the benefits of asset consolidation in a tone designed for children. Unified management, reduced liability, simplified tax structure. It's really in everyone's best interest, Briggs said. Especially yours, Robert. Robert asked one question. Does this include mineral rights? Briggs hesitated, looked at Garrett. Garrett's jaw tightened. It includes all rights associated with the property. That's standard. Robert nodded and said nothing else. Briggs packed his briefcase and left. Friday, Garrett came alone. He stood in the living room and made his case the way he always did, louder, closer, more certain. I've been carrying this family since Dad died. Since your accident. I kept the books. I paid the taxes. I held this thing together while you sat in this house and read maps. Robert met his eyes. I didn't ask you to take over. You didn't have to. Someone had to step up. Garrett leaned on the back of a kitchen chair. Robert doesn't get a vote. That's how it's always been because Robert can't see the big picture. Same line, same flat delivery. And this time, I watched something shift behind Robert's expression. A decision small, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking. Garrett scheduled a family meeting for the following Saturday. Both families invited. Signing ceremony. We'll make it official. Put it behind us. He left without waiting for a response. The screen door slapped shut behind him. Robert looked at me across the kitchen table. Saturday, I said. Dr. Grace Hollis called on a Tuesday morning while I was pouring coffee. Marin, sit down. Sit. I ran the sample 3 times. Full ICP-S analysis. Your clay returned lithium concentrations of 940 parts per million. I gripped the phone. The DOE threshold for economic viability was 500. 940 was nearly double. That's not a trace reading, Marin. That's a commercial-grade claystone. If this formation is as persistent as the field notes you sent me suggest, and the stratigraphic position supports it, you're looking at a deposit of significant scale. How significant? I can't project tonnage from one sample, but a persistent claystone at 42 feet across even a fraction of a 200-acre section. She paused. You'd be looking at a lithium resource that would attract serious interest from every battery-grade developer in the country. I stared at the jar of gray clay on the kitchen windowsill. Robert's father had pulled that sample from the ground 27 years ago. He had labeled it in block letters, stored it in a cedar box, told his family the dirt was worth more than the corn, and nobody had listened. Grace, I need this in writing, a formal essay report with your lab certification. I'll have it to you by Friday. I hung up and walked to the study. Robert was at the drafting table, his father's notebook open in front of him. 9:40, I said. He closed his eyes, not in shock, but in something quieter. Recognition, maybe. Or grief for a man who had been right about everything and died before anyone believed him. He knew, Robert said. He always knew. The jar of gray clay sat on the windowsill, catching the morning light. A lump of earth in a glass container that a house cleaner would have thrown away without thinking. And underneath it, underneath all of it, a fortune that had been waiting in the dark for someone patient enough to read the dirt. I sat on the porch that evening and assembled the pieces. A man paralyzed in a rockfall, a brother who used the accident to seize control, a family trust designed to hold assets that didn't belong to the trustee. A marriage arranged to make the disabled brother look settled and cared for, so nobody would question his absence from decisions. And underneath all of it, a mineral estate that belonged to Robert personally. A deed recorded in 1989 that Garrett either didn't know about or had chosen to ignore. A formation his father had identified, documented, and preserved in a cedar box on a shelf in a study nobody entered anymore. My husband was not what they told me he was. He was not a burden. He was not a transaction. He was not the helpless man in a wheelchair that two families had conspired to manage. Robert Holloway was a trained geologist sitting on a lithium deposit that his grandfather had deeded to him by name in a document that bypassed every legal structure Garrett had spent 4 years building. The man they called useless was the sole legal owner of the most valuable thing either family had ever touched. And the woman they'd bought for $500,000 to babysit him was the only person in two families qualified to prove it. I married a man my family called useless. Turns out he was the only one in either family who had never tried to sell me anything. If you've ever underestimated someone or been underestimated yourself, you already know how this feels. Stay with me. The room where they all find out is coming, and nobody's ready for it. Robert and I talked until 2 in the morning. The essay report would arrive Friday. The family meeting was Saturday. We had 72 hours to decide what kind of people we were going to be. We could ambush them, I said. Walk in with the essay and the deed and watch them scramble. Robert shook his head. That's what Garrett would do. He was right. And that sentence, 5 words, barely above a whisper, became the operating principle for everything that followed. We would not lie. We would not manipulate. We would not spring traps or engineer humiliation. We would walk into that room with documents that spoke for themselves, state the facts calmly, and leave. The plan was simple. First, retain a property attorney, not Garrett's man, an independent counsel in Grand Island who could verify the deed, confirm the split estate, and send a formal letter establishing Robert's ownership of the mineral rights. That letter would arrive at Garrett's address the morning of the meeting. Second, file a notice of mineral claim with the county recorder. A public record, irrevocable. Third, contact the minerals acquisition firm that had called our house. Not to negotiate, we weren't ready for that. Just to establish a point of contact, a signal that the mineral owner was aware and engaged. No drama. No revenge. Just paperwork and patience, and 2 people who had learned in very different ways that being underestimated is only a disadvantage if you stay quiet forever. I looked at Robert across the kitchen table, the man in the wheelchair, the man my mother had priced at $500,000, the man whose brother said didn't get a vote. You ready for Saturday? He picked up the brass compass from the table, turned it once in his palm, and set it down. I've been ready for 4 years. Lorraine called Thursday evening. I heard something interesting. I braced. My mother had a network of gossip connections that functioned like a low-grade intelligence service. Hairdressers, church women, second cousins who talked too much. Somebody said there's a mining company looking at land near Cedar Bluff. Is that true? Where did you hear that? Does it matter? Marin, if that land is worth something, her voice shifted to the warm tone again, the one she used when she wanted money. If that land is worth something, your father and I have a right to know. We made this happen. We brought you into this family. You sold me into this family. A pause. Then after everything we did, you'd cut your own mother out. I could hear Wade in the background coughing. Then his voice muffled. "Leave her alone, Lorraine." "Shut up, Wade." My father went silent. He always went silent. For 32 years, Wade Mathis had responded to conflict the same way, by disappearing into it. He was the kind of man who stood in the current and let the water push him wherever it wanted. I used to hate him for it. Now I just felt the weight of it. "We'll be at the meeting Saturday," Lorraine said. "Garrett invited us." "I know. We need to talk about our share." "There is no share, Mom." She hung up. I put the phone on the counter and stared at it. 2 families, 2 agendas, both converging on a living room in Cedar Bluff in 48 hours. Lorraine wanted money. Garrett wanted control. Robert wanted his name back. And I wanted something I'd never allowed myself to want, the right to stop being someone else's solution. Saturday was going to be loud. I intended to be quiet. Friday evening, the essay report arrived by email at 4:17 p.m. I printed 2 copies on the ancient inkjet in Robert's study. The attorney's letter had been sent that morning. Certified mail, signature required. It would reach Garrett's mailbox Saturday by 10 a.m., roughly 2 hours before the meeting. The mineral claim was filed. County recorder stamped. Public. Anyone could look it up. I spread everything on the kitchen table. The certified deed copy from Pauline at the recorder's office, the essay report from Dr. Hollis, the attorney's letter confirming Robert's sole ownership of the mineral estate, and the notice of filed claim. 4 documents. Each one a fact. No opinions, no accusations, no dramatic reveals. Just the record. Robert wheeled to the table and picked up the deed. "My grandfather signed this when I was a baby. He knew what he was doing. He knew Garrett." Robert set the deed down. Even then. I placed the jar of gray clay next to the papers. A visual. A reminder. The thing everyone had ignored, sitting right next to the proof of what it was worth. "Tomorrow," Robert said. He looked at the documents, then at me. "I'll say no." "You sure?" "I've been saying yes to Garrett for 4 years because it was easier. Because fighting from a wheelchair felt like losing before I started." He straightened in his chair. "I'm done being easy." I put everything into a leather folder, the same kind Lorraine had brought to my kitchen table 14 months ago. The one with the photographs and the typed letter and the promise of $500,000. A different folder now. A different offer. Tomorrow the whole family would be in one room. None of them would know what was in this folder. But they were about to find out. Saturday noon. The Holloway living room. Garrett had arranged the furniture like a boardroom. Dining chairs pulled into a semicircle. His attorney, Harlan Briggs, at a small table to the right with a stack of documents and 3 pens. Garrett at the center, standing because Garrett always stood when he wanted to feel tall. The witnesses, Brenda, quiet in the corner. 2 Holloway cousins. And Lorraine and Wade Mathis, who had driven 3 hours and arrived 20 minutes early because Lorraine always arrived early when she smelled money. Robert and I entered last. I pushed his chair through the front door and positioned him at the end of the semicircle facing Garrett. The leather folders sat on my lap. "Glad everyone's here," Garrett said. "This won't take long." He picked up the trust documents from Briggs's table and walked them to Robert. A pen on top, post-it flags pointing to the signature lines like little yellow arrows. "We've discussed this. The trust consolidation formalizes what we've all agreed on, unified management of the Holloway property, including all surface and subsurface rights under the existing family trust." He placed the documents on Robert's armrest. The pen rolled and settled against Robert's hand. "Just sign where I marked." The room was quiet. Lorraine leaned forward in her chair, watching the pen. Wade stared at the floor. Briggs adjusted his glasses. I held the leather folder with both hands, flat against my thighs, steady. Robert looked at the documents, then at the pen, then at Garrett. The whole room waited for the sound of a signature. Robert picked up the pen. Garrett exhaled. Briggs opened his own copy. Lorraine's fingers twitched on the arm of her chair. Robert turned the pen over in his hand. Once. Twice. Then he set it down on the armrest next to the unsigned documents. "No." Garrett blinked. "No, I won't be signing this." "Robert, you said I don't get a vote." Robert's voice was level and low, the steadiest sound in the room. You've said that every time I've tried to participate in a decision about my own property, at the kitchen table, in front of the attorney, in front of my wife. He placed both hands flat on the arms of his chair. I vote no. 3 words, and the room cracked. Garrett's face moved through 4 expressions in 2 seconds. Confusion, irritation, calculation, and then something harder. Something that looked like the first flash of fear. This isn't a vote. This is a legal consolidation. Harlan, explain it to him. He understands. Garrett, that was me. My voice sounded strange in the silence, almost clinical, the way I sounded when I presented field reports to skeptical review boards. Steady, factual, detached from the outcome. I opened the leather folder. Robert understands exactly what you're asking him to sign. He also understands what he owns. Every head turned. Lorraine's eyes locked on the folder. Wade stopped staring at the floor. Briggs leaned forward. The 2 Holloway cousins set down their phones for the first time all morning. I pulled out the first document and placed it on the table. This is a certified copy of a deed recorded in 1989 at the county recorder's office. It conveys the mineral estate of Section 14 separately from the surface estate to Robert James Holloway in fee simple. It's been public record for 35 years. Garrett didn't move. His eyes dropped to the document, then lifted to Robert, then to me. What? I placed the second document next to the first. This is a laboratory assay report certified by Dr. Grace Hollis at the University of Nebraska. The sample collected by Robert's late father from 42 feet below Section 14 returned lithium concentrations of 940 parts per million. The DOE threshold for commercial viability is 500. Then the third. This is a letter from Robert's independent counsel confirming his sole ownership of the mineral estate. The family trust holds the surface rights. The mineral rights have never been part of the trust. They belong to Robert. And the fourth. This is a notice of mineral claim filed with the county recorder as of yesterday. Public record. Irrevocable. I set the jar of gray clay on the table next to the documents. A glass jar with masking tape and block letters. 27 years old, worth more than every asset Garrett had spent 4 years managing. The room was so silent I could hear Briggs breathing. Garrett stared at the documents. His face was red. His hands were clenched at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice came out tight and stripped of every performance he had ever given in this room. This is. You can't just. That deed is 35 years old. Recorded deeds don't expire, Garrett. Lorraine stood up. The chair scraped the floor. Marin, honey. The warm voice, the reaching hands. We're family. After everything we sacrificed. You said I was always going to pay you back. I kept my voice low, in the same even register I'd used for the documents. I just did with the truth. Lorraine's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Wade sat with his head bowed. His hands were folded in his lap. He didn't look up. Briggs quietly closed his briefcase. He turned to Garrett. The conveyance is valid. The mineral estate was never part of the trust. Garrett slammed his palm on the table. The jar of gray clay jumped but didn't fall. I carried this family. Nobody answered him. Garrett paced. 3 steps left, 3 steps right. His hands opened and closed like he was looking for something to grab. I'll challenge it. I'll get my own attorney. That deed. There's no way Dad would have. Your grandfather signed it, Garrett. Not your father. And it was recorded by the county clerk 35 years ago. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. You can hire any attorney you want. They'll find the same document Pauline pulled for us last week. He turned to Briggs. Harlan. Briggs shook his head. I can't advise you to contest a recorded instrument with a clear chain of title. Not on this basis. Garrett's face twisted. You're supposed to be on my side. I'm supposed to give you accurate legal counsel. And my counsel is that the mineral estate belongs to Robert. Lorraine tried a different angle. She crossed the room and sat next to me, close enough that I could smell her perfume, the same brand she'd worn my entire childhood. Sweet and synthetic. Baby, think about this. We can work together, all of us as a family. We were never a family, Mom. We were a balance sheet. She pulled back. Her eyes went wet, not from sadness, but from the kind of frustration that lives in people used to getting what they want through tears. Wade spoke, the first words he'd said all day. I should have stopped this years ago. Everyone looked at him. He sat with his shoulders curved, staring at his hands. A man who had spent 30 years standing in the current. And for one moment, just one, I saw something real in his face. Not apology, not redemption. Just the weight of every time he had chosen silence. I didn't forgive him, but I saw him. Yeah, I said. You should have. Robert folded the documents and slid them back into the leather folder. He placed the jar of gray clay on top, screwed the lid tight, and set the folder on his lap. We're done here. Garrett stepped forward. You can't just leave. We need to discuss. There's nothing to discuss. The mineral rights are mine. The claim is filed, and I've retained counsel. Robert's voice didn't waver. If you want to talk, you can talk to my attorney. I moved behind his chair, took the handles and pushed him toward the door. Lorraine stood up one more time. Marin, don't you dare walk out on me. I stopped, turned, and looked at her, the pressed blouse, the painted nails, the eyes that had been appraising me since birth. I'm not walking out on you, Mom. I'm walking away from a price tag you put on me before I was old enough to know what it meant. She didn't follow. Wade stayed in his chair. Garrett stood in the center of the living room with his hands at his sides, the unsigned trust document still on the table, the pen still uncapped. I pushed Robert through the front door, across the plywood ramp, and down the gravel driveway. The wheels crunched on the stone. The sun was high and hard. Behind us, someone was yelling. Garrett, probably, though the words dissolved in the distance. On the porch, Robert reached back and touched my hand on the chair handle. Nobody asks anymore, he said quietly. We answer for ourselves now. I squeezed his hand once, then kept walking. We loaded into the truck. I placed the leather folder on the seat between us. The jar of gray clay sat on top, still warm from the living room. We drove home without speaking. The road was flat. The sky was wide. And for the first time in my life, the silence belonged to me. Here's what happened next. After Garrett contested the deed, his new attorney reviewed the chain of title, confirmed it was valid, and billed him $9,000 for the privilege. The family trust retained the surface estate. The mineral rights stayed with Robert. Robert and I interviewed 4 mineral development firms over the course of 6 weeks. We selected one with a verified ESG track record and a willingness to structure the lease around land preservation and community water monitoring. The royalty terms were strong. The numbers were the kind that make accountants sit up straight. We used the first distribution to establish the Holloway Mathis Fund, a small foundation supporting disabled adults in reclaiming financial autonomy and subsidizing home care aids in rural counties where people like Connie do critical work for wages that don't match it. To Lorraine and Wade, I returned the remaining portion of the $500,000. A clean wire transfer with a one-line memo. Final payment. No further obligations. Then I set a boundary, not a wall, a boundary. I would take their calls on the first Sunday of each month. I would not take their guilt. Garrett lost his standing in the family the way most people lose standing. Not in a single moment, but in the slow accumulation of cousins who stopped calling and neighbors who started asking questions. Robert's grandfather's brass compass now sits on the windowsill of the foundation office, next to a core drill bit and a framed photograph of Harold Holloway Sr. standing in a field, boots muddy, holding a jar of gray clay. Some people read dirt their whole lives and never find anything. Harold found everything. He just didn't live long enough to be believed. Robert and I never had a second wedding, never renewed vows, never staged a ceremony to replace the 11-minute transaction on the plywood ramp. We didn't need to. What grew between us was not a love story the way movies tell them. No rain-soaked confessions, no dramatic revelations of feeling. It was slower than that, steadier. Built over 12 months of shared meals and shared silence by 2 people who understood overburden because they had both spent their lives under it. He made me laugh. I made him visible. He gave me patience. I gave him proof that the world his father saw beneath the surface was real. We were partners before we were anything else. And the partnership was enough, more than enough, because it was built on the only thing that had ever held weight in either of our lives, the truth. On our 2nd anniversary, Robert handed me the brass compass. Keep it, I said. It was always meant for the person who finished the work. I held it in my palm. The brass was warm. The needle pointed north. 2 years earlier, I had stood at the end of a driveway and married a stranger because my mother told me it was time to pay her back. Now I stood on a porch I had earned the right to call home, holding the compass of a man who had believed in dirt when nobody else would. Nobody gets to set your price. And the people who try usually can't read what you're truly worth. That's my story. A folder, a jar of gray dirt, and one quiet no. If someone ever tried to make you the family's debt, take this as your sign. You are not for sale. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.